back to this lecture series for ethics. In this video, we will continue our discussion of the ethical theory of Immanuel Kant. And I want to begin by recalling to our minds one of the more foundational claims that Kant makes, which lies at the basis of his ethical theory. And that just is, for Kant, if we want to understand how to live a good human life and how to act well as a human being, we first need to ask ourselves, what is it that makes us different from other sorts of beings? Now that question in and of itself isn't all that new. We saw Aristotle and Aquinas also asking that question and giving a similar answer. For both Aristotle and Aquinas, what makes the human being different is really this ability to reason. And in particular with Aquinas, and also as we'll see with Kant, in addition to our ability to reason, also our ability to be free and make free choices. Now because Kant thinks that every ability a being has, right, must have some specific purpose, this leads him to ask the question, well, what is the purpose of our reason? Many entities, many beings, many animals don't have reason. In fact, only the human being does. So why do we have reason? Why is it there? What is its purpose? And this question actually contains two different questions, and we looked at Kant's answer to the first question in our previous video. The first thing you might ask is, well, are there any purposes for which what we're calling practical reason is poorly fitted and poorly suited? And remember what practical reason means, right? In the more technical way we've been explaining it, practical reason is just when we apply our reason to our will. But more generally, it's just our ability to think about and reason about how we're going to act. It's the ability we have to have our will not just determined by our instincts, not just determined by habit or social conditioning, but to have our will and our choices determined by our reason. And so the question he's asking is, well, why do we have this ability when other animals don't? And the first claim that Kant makes is that practical reason is poorly suited for bringing about preservation, prosperity, and happiness. Now, as we saw in our last video, the reasons for this are complex, but one of the main reasons is that all these things, the preservation of the species, the prosperity of the species, the happiness of the members within our species, all of that could have been achieved just as well and maybe even better just purely through instinct. He looks throughout the rest of the animal kingdom. He sees that many animals get along just fine, many species get along just fine, without the ability for practical reason. Their will and their choices are purely determined by instinct, and they seem to do just fine under normal circumstances. So his point is, well, practical reason may sometimes contribute to our preservation, prosperity, and happiness. That's true, but we don't need practical reason for that. Instinct can also achieve that. And if instinct can also achieve that, and in many cases achieve it better, then there must be some other purpose of our practical reason. And in this video, we are going to examine what that purpose is, and we're going to see how, given Kant's answer to that question, why it is that he thinks consequentialism is wrong. Now, we can already see some hints of why Kant would think consequentialism is wrong. If our practical reason is not necessarily well suited for bringing about happiness, then it seems like the utilitarians like Mill were off base. The purpose of a moral life isn't to use our reasoning abilities to think about how our actions can improve happiness, because that isn't the fundamental purpose of practical reason. We don't need practical reason for that. We can bring about happiness and prosperity through instinct. So we can already see to some extent that he's attempting to undercut the consequentialist or utilitarian view of ethics, where the point of ethics is to act so as we bring about the greatest happiness for the greatest number. But of course, that still leaves the big question unanswered. Let's say we accept the claim that the purpose of practical reason can't be preservation, prosperity, or happiness. What is its purpose? Well, Kant begins to tell us this in the following passage. He says, reason as a practical faculty, as one that is meant to influence the will, so that is just to say, practical reason, has yet been imparted to us. Its true function must be to produce a will that is good, not for other purposes as a means, but good in itself, for which reason was absolutely necessary. Okay, so what is he saying here? Well, the crucial clause here is that the purpose of practical reason is to produce a will that's good in itself. Now, what does that mean? Well, if something is good in itself, its goodness doesn't depend on anything outside of it. Right? So, for something to be good all by itself, it doesn't depend on the consequences it brings about or anything else other than that thing all by itself. Now, for a will to be good by itself and in itself, that would mean it would have to be good independent of any consequence that might be produced by it. That means the choices you make can be good and bad in themselves, regardless of whether what you're trying to achieve or the consequence or aim or goal you're trying to bring about, regardless of whether that is actually successfully achieved. And this makes sense if the purpose of practical reason isn't to bring about happiness or preservation or prosperity, or in another word, any good consequence, then all that's left is the will and the quality of the choices you make in themselves. But then we might think, well, what does that mean? How do we judge whether a choice that we make is good apart from the consequences? Right? We might say, well, the best way to judge whether a choice is good or bad is simply to say, well, did that choice work out for the best? But Kant is going to say no. And to see why Kant thinks that, let's return to a previous example that we talked a little bit about when we talked about Mill's utilitarianism. Mill tells us that if you see someone who's drowning in a river, that saving that person is the right thing to do, whether your motive was just saving someone from the kindness of your heart, or whether your motive was to be paid for your effort. Okay, and so we can understand this because for Mill, he's a consequentialist, your motive or intent doesn't matter. But let's change the scenario a little bit. Let's say you're walking along the side of the river and you see someone drowning, and out of the goodness of your heart, you jump into the river and you save this person's life. And let's say that it just so happens that this person goes on to be a serial killer or a mass murderer. Now, in that case, what would we say about your decision to save that individual? Would we say it was a bad decision? Would we say you reasoned incorrectly? Would we say you made the wrong choice? Well, it doesn't seem so. I mean, yeah, the choice didn't work out very well, but in any given circumstance, the likelihood that the person you would be saving in a river would turn out to be a mass murderer is extremely low. In the vast majority of cases, it's going to work out for the best that the person you save will just be a normal individual who'll just go about their lives, and you would have increased the flourishing and happiness of the world. So it would be very odd to say you made the wrong choice. And we can think about the other way as well. Not only sometimes can we say you make a good choice that has bad consequences, sometimes you make a bad choice that has good consequences. I would say it's pretty much always a bad choice to play the lottery, unless you're just doing so for entertainment. But as just a purely financial move, it's really a losing move. You're almost always throwing away your money. But let's say you buy a lottery ticket and you hit it big and you get the multi-million dollar jackpot. Then I would say, look, you made a bad financial decision because the chances of winning are so low as to be negligible. But it just happened to work out for you. So the point here is that the quality of our decision making, the way we judge how we use our will, the way we judge how we reason and think about what to do, should be independent of the consequences of our choices. A good choice can't be made bad just because bad luck intervened and the intended consequence didn't come about. And so that's Kant's point here. The purpose of practical reason isn't necessarily to produce some particular consequence, it's to produce a will that's good in itself. And how do we judge the goodness of the will? Well, think about the person who was walking along the river and saved the person's life. Whether that person turns out to be a kind-hearted individual who goes on to help others, or whether that person turns out to be a mass murderer, we would judge their choice based on what was their intent, what was their motivation. If their intent or motivation was to save another person's life and that was the right thing to do, then we say their will was good in itself no matter what actually happened afterward. And that fundamentally is the point that Kant is trying to make here, and it's showing again his critique of consequentialism. What matters is the quality of our will, and the quality of our will in itself is determined by the motivation or intention with which we act. Given this, the next question is the following. If having a will that's good in itself depends on our intent or our motivation with which we act, then how do we know whether we have a good motivation or intent? What does a good motive or intent look like? And in order to answer this question, Kant tells us that we'll have to inspect the concept of duty. He thinks if we understand the concept of duty, this will reveal to us the proper motive and intent that would characterize a good will, which, as we saw in the previous video, is the foundation of ethics, and that's the only unconditional good. It's the only thing that is always good, and it shines forth like a jewel, regardless of what consequences it produces. Okay, so in order to inspect this concept of duty, the main distinction you need to understand is this distinction between acting in conformity with duty and acting from duty. And I think the best way to explain this would be the following. So suppose you were in a circumstance, and you may have been in a circumstance like this before, it's actually probably likely you have been, where you knew you could lie or at least somewhat mislead someone and nothing bad would happen to you. And in fact, let's say by lying, you knew you would gain some sort of benefit, a monetary benefit, a social benefit, whatever the case is, right? You know with a very high probability you will not get caught and you will benefit from telling this lie. So now let's say you're thinking about, okay, should I tell this lie or not? And let's say at first you say, well, I know it's morally wrong to lie. And so you say, well, even though I really want to lie, even though I know it would benefit me in this case, I understand that's the wrong thing to do. So let's say you tell yourself that. But then as you start thinking more about it, you also say the following. And you know what? Even though I know there's not such a great chance I'm going to get caught, it's still possible. Maybe there's this other way that someone will find out, and maybe it won't end up benefiting me after all. Now, whether that latter statement is true or not, right, we stipulated at the beginning you weren't going to get caught, so maybe it's false. But whether that's true or not, let's just reflect on why did you need that second part of your reasoning? After you had already thought to yourself and convinced yourself that this is the morally wrong thing to do, why did you also need to convince yourself that lying wouldn't necessarily benefit you? And if you did need that second part of that thought process, then what does it say about the way in which you're acting? Do you really deserve praise for not telling a lie in this instance? Do you really deserve praise if the only way you were able to stop yourself from lying is by convincing yourself it might harm you ultimately? We've probably all been in this sort of situation where we first start out with the ethical reflection and then we end up sort of trying to twist it, so we say, well, look, our self-interest is also in play here. I also need to not tell a lie because it's going to harm me if I do. It makes us feel more comfortable. And those two different processes of thought are exactly what Kant is getting at with this distinction between acting in conformity with duty or acting from duty. Because you might say, well, okay, to act with duty, that's just to do what I'm supposed to do. So if I don't tell a lie, I've done my duty. And Kant would say, well, not quite. When you act in conformity with duty, you do what Kant calls the moral. So Kant will refer to the moral law as just a set of moral rules we have to follow. So Kant will say, when you act in conformity with duty, you act in a way you're supposed to. You follow the moral law, but what's motivating you is a non-moral reason. It's something other than respect for the moral law. So maybe it's just some instinct you have to do the right thing. Maybe you were born with a certain psychological disposition to do the right thing in this instance. Or maybe it was just in line with your self-interest to do the right thing. In any case, the reason you did the morally correct thing had nothing to do with the moral correctness of the act itself. It was merely that things lined up for you. There was some reason other than morality that convinced you to do it. In the example I was just giving, you were convincing yourself it was in your self-interest to tell the truth. And we can think about how often parents convince their children to not lie for just that reason. They say, look, you keep lying, eventually you're going to get caught. And if that's why you're doing the right thing, if that's why you're being honest, then ultimately you're merely acting in conformity with duty. On the other hand, we act from duty in Kant's view when not only do we do the right thing, but we do it for the right reason. Regardless of whether you want to do the right thing or not, regardless of whether it helps you or whether it makes you feel good, you simply say, I'm going to follow the moral law because I understand that the moral law deserves my respect, and I'm going to follow the moral law simply because I recognize that it's the right thing to do. And so the reason this matters is because, as you might guess, for Kant, the only sort of motivation that has any genuine moral worth, the only sort of motivation that qualifies as having a good will, is acting from duty. It's not enough to do the right thing because it helps you personally. It's not enough to do the right thing because it's in your self-interest. You have to do the right thing because you recognize it's what the moral law dictates, and it's because you have respect for the moral law. That is the sort of motivation or intent which for Kant characterizes acting from duty and characterizes having a good will. So to further understand this point, I want to look at 3 of the examples that Kant uses in the groundwork to illustrate the difference between acting in conformity with duty and merely acting from duty. So the first example we'll call the shopkeeper. And in this scenario, basically, what Kant is imagining is a shopkeeper deciding whether or not to charge a fair price for all customers. Because you can imagine a shopkeeper says, well, when an inexperienced customer comes in, maybe this is a used car lot or something, I'll jack up the price, and when a more experienced customer comes in, I'll charge a fair price. And let's assume for the sake of argument that that's an unfair or morally wrong thing to do. Let's assume that the moral law would say one ought not to do that. So the first thing Kant says, well, look, if you're a prudent merchant, if you're a good business person, then you might say, well, I'm not going to do that because if I start cheating customers, I'll get a bad reputation around town and I'll ultimately lose business. And so he says, first, let's reflect on if there's a shopkeeper who charges a fair price for that reason. And we ask ourselves, did they act in conformity with duty or did they act from duty? And Kant will say the answer is clear. This person clearly acted in conformity with duty. The only reason they charged a fair price and did the right thing is because they saw it was in their self-interest. It wasn't really because they cared about the moral law or cared about treating other people fairly. It was simply good for them. And so in this case, he would say if someone acts in that way, then their decision has no genuine moral worth. They didn't have a quality motivation or intent. They did not have a good will. But what if someone does the exact same action but for a different reason? Now imagine a shopkeeper who really does, let's say, ultimately wants to charge people an unfair price. The shopkeeper recognizes that, let's say, there are certain circumstances where you could charge an unfair price and no one would find out. Maybe the person is just passing through town, they don't know anyone in town, so you're not going to get a bad reputation. And let's say the shopkeeper says, look, although I really want to charge this unfair price, because it will help my bottom line, I'm still not going to do so. And I'm not going to do so because I know it's wrong, because I know it violates the moral law. At that point, Kant would finally say that this person has acted from duty. They have acted with respect for the moral law, and therefore their action has genuine moral worth. But notice the difference here is not in the action or the consequence. Both of the shopkeepers we imagined did the exact same thing with the same result. Both charged a fair price to all the customers that came in. The only difference was, what was their motive? Why did they charge a fair price? For Kant, in our ethical actions, that's really what makes all the difference. So now let's move to the second case that Kant uses. And this I'll call the case of the begrudging self-preserver. Now, as a preliminary here, the first thing you need to know about this case is that to understand what Kant is doing here, you have to accept a view that he has for the sake of argument, which may be controversial. Namely, in Kant's view, suicide was always morally wrong. There's an absolute moral prohibition against suicide. Now, of course, that's a controversial position to take, and philosophers argue about it amongst themselves, as do many other people. But we're going to put that aside, because just to understand the example, you have to understand that's where he's coming from. Okay, so the first thing he says, let's begin to read the first part of this passage. Kant tells us, to preserve one's life is one's duty, and besides, everyone has an immediate inclination to do so. But on account of this often anxious care with which the greatest part of humanity attends to it, it has yet no inner worth and their maxim no moral content. So what is he saying? He's saying, well, look, it is a duty in his view to preserve your life. And this would, of course, mean not committing suicide, but presumably also taking care of yourself within a reasonable way that would cause your life to continue going on. And he says, for most people, this is not a very difficult thing. For most people, we have an immediate inclination to do this. And what does that mean? You can think of it as like an instinct or just a natural drive to preserve our life. So for the average person, it is no great challenge for them to do what is necessary to preserve their life. In fact, many people will go to great lengths to do so. So when you see someone walking around who has not taken any active steps to end their life, he says, yes, they're doing the right thing because they're preserving their life. But do their actions deserve any great moral praise? Do their actions have what he will call genuine moral worth? Well, no. Because the reason they're doing it isn't out of respect for the moral law. The reason they're doing it isn't because they recognize it would be wrong of them to end their own life. Rather, the reason they're doing it is just out of their natural, biological, inborn instinct or inclination. This natural drive that we have to extend our life and not want to die. And so for that reason, he says, that's great that they're following the moral law, but they don't deserve any praise on that account. We can't say in this instance they've acted with a good will. But then so he says they preserve their lives in conformity with duty, but not from duty. But then let's change up the scenario a little bit. He says, continuing on, by contrast, if adversities and hopeless grief have entirely taken away the taste for life, if the unfortunate man, strong of soul, more indignant about his fate than despondent or dejected, wishes for death, and yet preserves his life without loving it, not from inclination or fear, but from duty, then his maxim has moral content. So if we imagine someone down in their luck who's just faced horrible adversity, who is overcome with grief, whose life no longer has any happiness, joy, or pleasure, and if we imagine a person who wishes for death, what they want to do is they want to die. Similarly to before, and just to keep the analogy, we imagine a shopkeeper who wants to cheat his customers. And we imagine a person who would rather their life end, who would rather die, and yet they preserve their life. Not because they love their life, not because they want to continue living, but merely from duty. If they preserve their life merely because they recognize that in Kant's view it would be wrong of them to end their life, then he says they have acted with a good will. Their maxim, or the way they have chosen, the way they have acted, has genuine moral worth. And again, notice the point here. In both of these cases, both self-preservers, they both took the same action, the same consequence results. The person continues living. All the difference is made in the motivation or intent. Did they preserve their life just out of their base animal instincts, or did they preserve their life using their reason and saying to themselves, I know this is the wrong thing to do, and I have respect for the moral law? If it's the latter, then we can say that person acted from duty. The third and final example we'll look at involves a comparison of two different philanthropists, or two different people who, in whatever way, with their time, their energy, their money, are helping others. So first we're going to examine what I'll call the kind-hearted philanthropist. Kant says the following: to be beneficent or helpful or generous where one can is one's duty. And besides, there are many souls so attuned to compassion that even without another motivating ground of vanity or self-interest, they find an inner gratification spreading joy around them and can relish the contentment of others insofar as it is their work. So what does this mean? He says, look, there are some people who genuinely take joy in helping other people and reducing suffering and being generous with their time, their energy, and their money, and doing what they can to better the lives of other people. There are people who do that not just out of a sense of duty because they feel that they have to, morally speaking, but it genuinely gives them psychological gratification. So let's say someone donates generously to charity and they help out with their time, and they do it, and what is motivating them is that sort of joy or gratification they get. Kant would say, I assert that in such a case an action of this kind, however much it conforms with duty, still has no true moral worth. And again, why is this? Well, this person wasn't motivated by respect for the moral law. They weren't generous with their resources because they understood that there's a duty to be generous. Rather, they did it because of the joy and satisfaction it gave them. And if that is the ultimate motivating factor, then they really weren't motivated by respect for the moral law at all. They were motivated by the feeling they get of gratification from, as Kant puts it, spreading joy around them. So now compare this to the begrudging philanthropist. So Kant says, suppose then that the mind of that friend of humanity were beclouded by his grief. So this person who previously loved to help others, again, a tragedy befalls this person. His mind is clouded with grief. This grief extinguishes, as Kant says, all compassion for the fate of others, but he still retains the means to benefit others in need, but the need of others did not touch him because he is sufficiently occupied with his own. And that now his inclination no longer stimulates him to it, he were yet to tear himself out of this dead insensibility, and to do the action without any inclination, solely from duty. Not until then does it have its genuine moral worth. So he's saying here, look, if we imagine someone whose compassion or joy for helping others was completely extinguished because of a personal tragedy in their own life, they still had the means to help, but they just didn't have the heart to do it anymore. He said if somehow they were able to get out of this dead insensibility, if somehow they were able to still be generous, still help others, merely because they recognized it was their duty, then he says this person's action would have genuine moral worth. We would know this person has a good will. And why would we know that? Because it wasn't the joy, it wasn't the gratification, it wasn't the sympathy for others that was motivating them. The only thing that was motivating them was respect for the moral law and understanding that this is what is demanded of them. So to sum up this point, we can characterize the difference between acting in conformity with duty and acting from duty in the following way. When we act in conformity with duty, something else is motivating us. Our own self-interest, some natural instinct we have, or an inclination. Right? And by inclination, we might just mean a psychological disposition or a fact about our personality. For instance, the kind-hearted philanthropist who just got lucky and happened to be born with this kind, generous personality that gives them joy from helping others. If that person is just acting from inclination, then that's great that they're being generous and doing the right thing, but it's merely in conformity with duty. The same if you're doing the right thing out of a basic instinct or habit, and the same if you're just doing the right thing because it helps you. The only case in which we are acting from duty, the only case in which our actions have genuine moral worth is when we act with respect for the moral law. It's when we put aside our instincts and our inclinations and our self-interest and everything about the animal side of us, everything that has to do with what we want or desire, and simply through an act of pure reason we say, I know what the moral law is, I understand what it expects of me, I understand what it demands of me, and I'm going to do this action merely because it is the right thing to do. That is the case where we act from duty, and that is finally what it means to have a good will. And to answer our initial question, this gives us an answer to what the purpose of practical reason is. The purpose of practical reason is to produce a will that is good in itself. The goodness of a will is determined by our motive or intent, and the proper motive or intent to have is the motivation of acting from respect for the moral law itself. So what Kant is ultimately saying is that if you understand that you are a being with reason, with practical reason, then you must also understand that you have a duty and responsibility to, in all cases, show absolute respect for the moral law. And it's this idea which underlies not just his anti-consequentialism, not just his anti-utilitarianism, but also the moral absolutist part of his ethics. If we must always follow the moral law, if we must always show respect for the moral law, then we can't let any proposed benefit or harm or consequence get in the way of following that moral law. As a being with reason, you have a responsibility to act from duty, show respect for the moral law, and ultimately develop a good will. Now, a common reaction to this distinction Kant makes between acting in conformity with duty and from duty is to think it's really quite strange. I think in some cases, in some situations, it makes good intuitive sense. Like the shopkeeper case, we're likely to say, yeah, I mean, if you're only charging a fair price because it's in your self-interest, that's great, you're doing the right thing, but you don't really warrant our moral praise. But think about the philanthropist examples. Would we really praise someone who donates to charity merely because it's their duty but doesn't care about the people they're helping? Would we really praise someone who's generous with their time and money, but it gives them no satisfaction to see other people helped? Would we praise someone who, when they're doing the right thing, very much wishes that they were actually doing the wrong thing? That their character hasn't developed in such a way that they take any joy in doing what is morally right? Aristotle certainly thought that the moral exemplar, the person we look up to as a moral individual, not only would do the right thing, but would also take pleasure in it. And that's why he thought to develop yourself as a moral agent, as a moral person, you need to learn to take pleasure in doing what's right. So why does Kant take such a strange position? Why does he say that the only case in which we have a good will and act from duty is when we allow reason alone, without our inclinations or our pleasure or happiness being the motive forces behind what we do? Why to deserve moral praise, why do I have to not just help other people, for instance, but also, it seems, wish I wasn't helping other people? It just seems very odd. Now, to defend this, I think that what Kant is ultimately getting at is that he wants to eliminate what philosophers call moral luck. And in general, moral luck was this concept talked about by a philosopher named Thomas Nagel, and it just refers to certain situations where how we judge another person from a moral point of view depends on factors completely outside of their control. And the most common example of this would be what I'll call the reckless driver case. So first imagine this. So let's imagine a reckless driver who has too much to drink, way more than they should to be driving, gets behind the wheel of their car, drives in a very haphazard fashion, swerving down the road, and ultimately, let's assume there's a pedestrian or a child in the road, and they strike and hit and kill that child. Okay, now, if we imagine what's going to happen to this person, they would be punished with a quite severe penalty. They'd be looking at least charges of manslaughter. And we might say rightly so. They acted irresponsibly, they got behind the wheel of the car when they should not have, and it resulted in the death of the child. It seems perfectly just. But now let's tweak the scenario. Imagine the same person who drinks the same amount, way more than they should, they get behind the wheel of the car, they drive in a haphazard, dangerous fashion, in the exact same way that the first driver did. But it just so happens there is no person or child in the road for them to hit, so they just happen to get home safely. Now, if this person didn't encounter any police, they wouldn't be punished at all. If they did encounter the police, then they would get a punishment for a DUI. But the punishment for a DUI is not nearly as severe as the punishment, for instance, for manslaughter. And notice the idea that the first driver was significantly worse from a moral point of view than the second does seem problematic when we put this comparison in front of us. Because the only thing that was different between the two cases is the following: that there was someone in the road to be hit by the vehicle and die. And neither of the drivers had anything to do with that. The first reckless driver was not in control of whether a child was in the road. The second reckless driver was not in control of the fact that a child was not in the road. So they did the exact same thing, but they received very different levels of legal punishment. And look, maybe there are good reasons, practically speaking, why the legal system has to treat these situations differently, but think about it from a moral point of view. Is it really fair that from a moral point of view, we should look at these drivers as any different? If you would look at the first reckless driver as close to being a murderer, then why don't you look at any drunk driver who doesn't just happen to hit anyone as a murderer? And this is the point behind moral luck. It's this idea that sometimes the way we judge people has a lot to do with things that they had nothing to do with. And as I said, Kant wants to completely eliminate this. And so you might say, well, what does this have to do with the examples that we have examined thus far? I think the best place to see this and understand why Kant believes this comes in the following passage. Kant tells us, in the case of what is to be morally good, it is not enough that it conform with the moral law. It's not enough that you do the right thing. It also must be done for its sake. You have to do the right thing for the sake of the moral law, out of respect for the moral law. And if you don't, this is the crucial part, if you don't, then that conformity is only very contingent and precarious. So his point is the following. If you always act in a morally correct manner, but you're only always acting in conformity with duty, then the line between you doing what's right and you doing what's wrong is a very thin line. Suppose your principle is, I'm always going to do the right thing, but only if it helps my self-interest. Well then, as soon as your self-interest switches, you'll be doing the wrong thing. Remember the example I gave earlier with the shopkeeper and an inexperienced customer comes in, this person's from out of town, they don't know anyone. If your ultimate principle is self-interest, then there's nothing to stop you from cheating this customer. And that means your commitment to doing the right thing is contingent and precarious. It's not solid, it's not firm, it's not reliable. And so in all the cases we've looked at, all the examples that Kant uses, we can ask the question, well, yeah, they did the right thing, but what would have happened if circumstances were slightly different? So in the shopkeeper case, what if it wasn't in the shopkeeper's interest to charge a fair price? Well, it seems like the shopkeeper wouldn't have done so. What about the self-preservation case, where we imagine the person who just has a natural instinct to preserve their life? Well, what if this depressed individual didn't have that natural instinct to preserve her life? Then what would they have done? Think about the philanthropist case again. We're imagining someone who's just naturally kind-hearted. They were just born that way, that they love to help other people. What if they weren't born that way? What if they didn't have that natural kind-heartedness? What if they just didn't get lucky in the way their personality was formed, either through their, psychological factors, their biology, genetics, or how they were brought up? What if they weren't born with that kind-hearted personality? Would they still be as generous? The point is, if the reason you're doing the right thing is not out of respect for the moral law itself, if you're merely acting in conformity with duty, then if you do the right thing, it's merely a matter of luck. Your self-interest just so happened to line up with what's morally right. Your personality just so happened, you got lucky, and it made you more likely to do the right thing. And that means your action is not reliably moral. And so this is what Kant means when he says that if all that mattered is acting in conformity with duty, then your ability to do the right thing would be very contingent, precarious, not reliable, and firm. And so what that means, how should we judge people? Should we judge people on the basis of whether they got lucky and were born with the right personality? Should we judge people on the basis of whether they just happen to be in a circumstance where it helps them to do the right thing? No. We shouldn't judge people based on whether they act in conformity with duty. We should judge people based on whether they act from duty. Because while we cannot control our circumstances, we can't control our self-interest, we can't control our personality and our inclination, and we can't control our natural instincts. As human beings, what we can control is our reason. We have free control over the choices that we make. And Kant believes it is within all of our power to choose to do the right thing simply because it's the right thing to do. To act from duty. And if that is within all of our power, then that is how we should judge people. And so the person we should see as the moral exemplar is the person who doesn't want to help others but does it anyway. Because we know this person has made the choice that they're going to show respect for the moral law, that they're going to do the right thing not because it feels good, but simply because it's the right thing to do. So I will stop there. Thank you as always for listening, and I will see you next time.